Alrighty, so let's get started with the questions. Cindy McCain back there is gathering some more cards. Those of you sending in some via chat, Sherry Johnson will let me know what those are here shortly. And Jane Curtis is also collecting. You'll see her back there. So the first question is for Groom, Wondzell, Anderson. Groom, Wondzell, Anderson, you guys ready? Was flow accounted for as a variable in your studies? That seems important. For Groom, Wondzell, and Anderson, what about flow and how was that accounted for?
So,
You have to do that. It catches you.
okay, I won't. We did not have we had only occasional measurements of discharge in our study, so we were not able to use that discharge directly as a covariate with respect to temperature response. So we used watershed area as a surrogate for discharge.
Actually, my answer is about the same. We did have annually tried to get some flow measurements of our streams with Marshall-McBurney meters, but they were probably the wrong tool for the job. Our streams were too small. And so we did use watershed area as one of the covariates available for the models. It didn't happen to enter into the models, but that's how we tried to account for it.
Same response. We have periodic measures of flow that we take with a Marsh-McBurney meter. And our approach in DMS now is definitely area-based. Sorry. Our approach is to use area-based measurements as well as the periodic flow measurements, but we don't have continuous flow measures.
So I think that microphone's on. You might just have to speak up a little bit. Bring it closer. There you go. Okay. Thank you. Next question. What characteristics of your timber sale area, so assuming you guys sitting here have a timber sale area, do you need to analyze to identify which reaches are sensitive to treatment and buffer design? So what characteristics of your timber sale area do you need to analyze? What characteristics to identify which reaches are sensitive to treatment and buffer design? Where would you start?
I'll jump in. I think for ours, our analysis said that shade was important and the basal area was related to shade, so I think it's how much you leave around those streams, immediately around those streams, that's going to matter the most for the stream temperatures.
I don't think our study would give a clear answer to that question. Our buffers were relatively narrow. They were 10 meters wide on a side. And they were extremely small headwater streams, so we found these other variables that would describe the attributes of the stream to be more important than what was left behind. So I don't think we have a good way to answer that question from our study.
Another perspective on it is the work of the density management studies is done on BLM, basically your one section areas, and so it's really important to understand what's going on in your neighbors, because over the course of the DMS study, we've seen our entire boundaries around some of our units be harvested over time, and so what was once a good control reach can become non-usable as a control reach. So context is really important.
For the animals that I've been studying, existing conditions of coarse substrate, for example, talus, that is on the ground surface, and also existing conditions for downwood seem to affect our treatment results and may be associated with why we're seeing mixed effects. I think if you have those coarse substrates in the ground and a lot of legacy downwood, those are areas where salamanders, for example, can occur and be ameliorated from the effects of harvest. So if you have those at the site, that may be an additional factor to consider. So a future study might want to control that sort of thing among sites.
Just keep in mind that these guys' talks were focused on temperature. You're going to be hearing groups talking about wood and landscape analysis here later. So I think we'll be building on each other. Question for Dee Dee. Why do you think the interim guidance for riparian reserves became the de facto widths? Was the riparian reserve module just too much work within the watershed analysis process?
Well, so I'm going to have opinion about this. As I personally have seen the Northwest Forest Plan being implemented, I think people went to the easiest place to go first. And if they didn't have to mess with riparian reserves, that was easy to do, for example. So if there were areas on the landscape where they had upland outside of a 1 tree height buffer or a 2 tree height buffer, they may have prioritized those as the first ones to go to because that was easy. Some aspects of the riparian reserve module are difficult to implement. I showed that list of species that might be associated with riparian areas, and we don't have knowledge of where those species are. And so that's a daunting list. If you have this huge list of lichens and bryophytes and mollusks and amphibians and you don't know where they are, then you're kind of stuck at the beginning. So you need to either use habitat as a surrogate, and we do have some idea for habitat for those organisms, but even for habitat, we don't know very much. So I think maybe there were some stalls out of the gate to get started, just because the riparian reserve module was a little bit complicated to get started with.
And I would add to that, as someone who led 3 or 4 watershed analysis teams, yeah, once you got to that point, there really wasn't any additional information I could add to the bounty that already came from the scientists to make any recommendations for changes. We really didn't know enough. And I still don't think we know enough, quite honestly. For the whole suite, probably not. But then we decided to leave the reserves sort of fixed and standardized, and we thought more about what we could do within them without changing the boundary of them. Dave, you want to comment on that at all?
That's certainly been my experience over 15 years of trying to implement things. I really do believe there's a lot of flexibility in the Northwest Forest Plan and the direction for how we do or do not do things in those riparian reserves to do some positive things on the landscape without a great deal of need to spend a substantial amount of time and effort in trying to tamper with what those boundaries are. I think you know, the site potential tree, the 300 feet, whichever is greater as a minimum distance, is probably legitimate, and I think lost in the shuffle, especially on some of our larger systems. Those aren't even the broadest extent of the riparian reserves. We have systems on the Mackenzie where the widest extent is actually the 100-year floodplain. So it really wasn't, has never been a real hindrance to me in terms of thinking about how I might like to manage having those default distances.
So one thing I didn't make a strong point of when I talked about the ACS objectives and components is that ACS was really envisioned from the get-go to be something to consider at the watershed scale or landscape scale. And as you drill down to site scale or stand scale operations, then the idea wasn't that everything's getting protected, maintained and restored everywhere. And I think that there has been a precautionary approach, and we're getting more of a one-size-fit-all, protect everything everywhere mentality. But that was not the original vision. There was expected to be quite a lot of variation at the site level or stand level, yet conditions be maintained or restored at larger scales. And that's another difficult concept to try to implement, but getting some variability out there at watershed scales was something that was intended.
Question for Paul. You mentioned mitigating effects to microclimates from variable buffer widths. If a riparian reserve's microclimate is a product of land management activities, i.e. dense, stagnating timber, wouldn't effects to microclimates be beneficial? What are you mitigating?
So I think that use of terminology probably comes from a lot of the sort of the emphasis on a stream-centric perspective. I think in terms of the riparian area, one of the things that you may be interested in doing is, from the restoration point of view, creating some variability in those riparian areas. So you might be actually not necessarily mitigating microclimate, but you might be enhancing microclimates in a way that would allow you to produce a different set of understory vegetation conditions, perhaps some variability in terms of species composition, get some allochthonous inputs from hardwoods and whatnot. So no, it's not necessarily meant to be necessarily totally mitigating, but the idea and use of that terminology from my perspective was oftentimes the question is, what are you doing to my stream environment?
Sherry, let's grab a couple from our, there's actually 40 sites out there watching this via live stream.
Just one question.
And only one person out there is awake. No, just kidding. Sorry guys, I'm just kidding. I envision y'all at home in your jammies watching this on your laptop on the couch. So, for Steve, is present-day hyporheic flow exchange partially determined by past catchment disturbances and sediment sources? You want to be able to read this?
So I think that's an important question that we don't have a really good answer for. We would expect that past practices that might have led to delivery of lots of fine sediments to channels to have clogged interstitial spaces between gravels and things in the stream bed, and therefore might limit hyporheic exchange. The problem is that turnover of gravels and high flows will tend to wash those things out as well. And so there's evidence in the literature that those past practices, I shouldn't say that, I should say that introductions of fines can limit hyporheic exchange, but that's never actually been tracked someplace where we have land use practices that we expect to introduce fines and observe then a change in hyporheic exchange. So we would expect that to happen, but it's not been documented, and we don't know how long it would persist if it did happen.
Another geeky question for you, Steve. How did you account for error in equipment? I think it says that plus or minus 2 degrees Celsius.
We didn't. We knew that that could be a possible confounding factor to our study, but we didn't have any really good way to incorporate that into our analysis and control for it. So we simply have to accept the fact that that difference is there. When you work with the digital equipment, it doesn't, you know, it's going to give you a measurement and it's going to change by 0.2 degrees. You're not going to get a 0.07 degree change in temperature. It's going to change by 0.5 degrees. So you get that kind of data out of digital equipment. Obviously, the better the resolution, the smaller the impact that will have on your analysis. But we couldn't think of a good way to control for that, so we didn't.
Okay. There's one more question. I'm going to save it for later because it's more of a landscape analysis kind of question. So that was pretty easy. You guys, you're off the hook. Thank you very much. We're going to move on.